Juanita, I want to start with Senator Manchin's opposition to the For the People Act and defense of the filibuster. Two House Democrats called Manchin out this morning, including Congressman Jim Clyburn. Take a listen.
Please, Mr. Manchin, vote to limit debate so we can set a date and have an up or down vote on whether or not we are going to have a continuation of voting rights in this country.
Now we have the opportunity to actually do something about it. And Senator Manchin would rather preserve Jim Crow on some outdated theory of bipartisanship.
Juanita, where do Democrats go from here?
Honestly, Alicia, the deck is stacked against Democrats right now when you have these voter suppression bills happening in states across the country, and then someone like Manchin, a Democrat, going out and saying this, making this hard line against the For the People Act, which we all know is the cornerstone of our democracy. Look, every single person deserves to have their vote counted. Every single person who votes deserves to have their vote upheld and the decision of an election upheld. And that's as clear as it can be. And I completely agree with DNC Chair Jamie Harrison that Manchin is dead wrong. And so what Democrats need to focus on now is communicating that to voters, keeping this drumbeat going. While Manchin might not succumb to the pressure that he's going to feel from everyone coming at him from externally as well as internally within the Democratic Party, it's important that the public understands this, makes those calls, get grassroots advocacy going at full force, especially through the August recess, because there's so much at stake here. Every single vote is at stake. Our democracy is at stake, especially when you have a Republican Party that is not interested in any bipartisan solution. And that's what I found striking about Manchin's op-ed this morning, is that he's saying he wants bipartisanship, but there are not 10 good Republicans who know better and will do better, because they're all in this vice grip of Trump, and they're going to be beholden to Trump, especially as he continues to get on the trail and spread even more lies that they're all just sitting by and being complicit in, as we see our democracy take hit after hit from Trump and Republicans.
Max, I think you'll agree that Juanita just hit the nail on the head there, because you have Democrats struggling to protect voting rights at the same time that you have Republicans pushing aggressive legislation in multiple states. You argue it is a plot to steal the next election, writing, quote, while GOP efforts are ultimately aimed at the 2024 election, they will first make their impact felt in 2022. Off-year elections are always tough for the party in power. This one will be tougher still because of Republican-driven voter suppression, reapportionment, and gerrymandering. You go on to say this brings us to a nightmare scenario: a Republican-controlled Congress overturning the 2024 presidential election results to install Trump or a Trump mini-me in the White House. Max, it's going to keep a lot of people up tonight. What will it mean for our democracy if your nightmare scenario becomes a reality?
Well, I don't want to be overly alarmist, but I think we should be alarmed, because potentially this could be the end of American democracy. I never thought I'd be saying something like that. It would have sounded incredible even a year ago. But remember, just a few months ago, you had a majority of congressional Republicans voting to not recognize electoral votes cast for Joe Biden. And of course, this came right after an attack on the Capitol incited by Trump and his supporters. So I feel like we've really crossed a very dangerous Rubicon here, where Trump and Republicans will stop at nothing to regain power. And that includes demolishing our democracy, which is what they are in the process of doing. They are using these voter restriction bills as well as gerrymandering at the state level to try to take back control of Congress from Democrats in the midterm election. And if they do that, and if the 2024 presidential election is at all close, they will be in a position not to recognize the outcome, to throw the election to the House, and potentially allow the Republicans with control of the majority of state delegations to seat Donald Trump or some other Republican in the White House. I mean, this would be truly the end of American democracy. And this is, I wrote this last week, and I said, I hope that I'm wrong. Please, somebody tell me why I'm wrong. Nobody has told me why I'm wrong. This is actually a very plausible, very dangerous scenario. So I would say to Senator Manchin what I said in the article, which is you can choose either between saving the filibuster or saving our democracy. And it saddens me to see that Senator Manchin wants to save the filibuster at the cost of potentially destroying our democracy. That's a choice that doesn't make any sense to me.
Well, Max, Georgia Republicans booed the state's Governor Brian Kemp at an event this weekend. Kemp, of course, remains a Trump loyalist despite refusing to give in to Trump's demands to overturn the state's election. What does all of that tell you about the Republican base?
Well, the Republican base is out for blood. They want to eliminate any Republican office holders who voted to certify the election returns that made Joe Biden president. So they were after Brian Kemp, as well as the Georgia Secretary of State, Brad Raffensperger, both of whom were instrumental in certifying that state's results. They want them to pay a heavy price. They're also after other Republican officials in other states. And basically, the signal they're sending is that anybody who dares to certify a Democratic election victory is going to face severe retribution, including death threats, including being voted out of office. This is all part of this Republican attempt to ensure that they will not lose the next two elections, and they're willing to do that at any cost.
Juanita, that comes at the same time that you have new reporting from the New York Times raising alarm about Democratic outreach for 2022, which, as Max noted, is already going to be a harder year for Democrats, given that they are currently in power. A new Democratic report warns, quote, Democrats in 2020 lacked a core argument about the economy and recovering from the coronavirus pandemic, one that might have helped candidates repel Republican claims that they wanted to keep the economy shut down. The report also concludes the party leaned too heavily on anti-Trump rhetoric. I wonder, first of all, if you just agree with that analysis and what case you think Democrats need to make to voters going into this election year.
Look, while there might have not as clear, it clearly was a messaging that resonated with a historic amount of voters who elected Joe Biden as president. I think going into 2022, they absolutely should be leveraging every single thing Biden has done to get this pandemic under control, to get investments in direct aid to families in need and people in need across this country, as well as to push for investments in our economy and jobs and that are much needed, especially in this moment as we're starting to reemerge from this pandemic, because we haven't fully reemerged just yet. And so there's a lot of work to be done that Biden is doing. And so I think leaning on that is going to be explicitly important. Honestly, I think it's smart of Democrats to focus more on their vision for the country, especially what they plan to do over the next session of Congress, versus leaning into fighting every single thing that Trump raises. Sticking to a clear, focused message is going to be important. Message discipline is the key here, because that's what voters respond to, but also getting hyper local when they do make call outs. Don't tie it to Trump. Tie it to the representative. Tie it to the state legislator. Tie it to the individual in the state, in the district, in the community that voters will likely recognize, instead of tying anything back to Trump, because this isn't a national conversation for Democrats in the midterms. It's hyper local. And so stick to the adage, all politics is local going into 2022.
Ben, the reason I needed to have you be a part of this conversation, so thank you for your patience, is that you add to this toxic brew a new baseless conspiracy saying that Trump will be reinstated into office sometime in August. Just how widely is that belief held among Trump supporters, and how does something like this take off on social media?
Well, this is just the remnants of January 6th. It's really no different from what we saw back then. It's the same stuff, just propelled into this Arizona audit. There is this idea that, you've probably heard this from Mike Lindell, the MyPillow guy, that this Arizona audit that is being run by people who, in part, support the QAnon conspiracy theory, that they are, finding some massive wide-scale fraud in Arizona. That's not true. That's not what's happening. In fact, there's really nothing that they've found so far yet, and they're trying, trust me. But they believe that this will have a domino effect, that whatever they find in Arizona, which, by the way, they've checked for bamboo in the ballots to prove that the ballots were shipped from China. It's that ridiculous. It's that, tinged, I guess you could say. They believe that will start a domino effect. Well, that will happen in Pennsylvania and then Michigan and Wisconsin and all these other places. And that by August, even though the Arizona audit won't even be completed by then, that Donald Trump will somehow be reinstated through some legal process that does not exist.
So, Ben, Trump is now suspended from Facebook until at least 2023. I wonder if you've noticed a change in his supporters' behavior online since he lost his megaphone to really rile them up. And I ask that because I think of both the point that Juanita made about how Democrats need to, have laser-like vision to not go after every one of these Trump side stories. And then I also think about everything that Max laid out about the potential consequences of having our democracy fundamentally questioned. How much of this is just going to go back to the former president being deplatformed?
It's a good question. The thing is, people don't follow him around the internet. People find him on the internet. He does a very good job of picking fights and responding to conflict. But, tens of thousands of people were reading that blog that he put up and took down because not enough people were viewing it. So the deplatforming in terms of limiting his reach and him being part of the conversation, it has taken away a lot of his platform. And he's going to have to find a way back on Facebook until then. In 2023, he has a chance to go back on Facebook. And there's going to be a crossroads from if he decides to run from a campaign perspective. Do you behave and then, try to get back on the platforms and go from there? Or do you make this part of some sort of martyrdom, make this part of your fight, and to act egregiously in the run up to that potential decision? We've lived with Donald Trump for the last 5 years or so as a public figure. I think we know the answer to that, and that's what we're going to see in 2023.
Right. Max, I only have a minute left, but I do want to ask you, the argument you're making about starting the steal, right, sort of as a foil to stop the steal, does that work without Donald Trump in the mix, right? Like, if he is not front and center, is that argument as charged as Republicans need it to be?
Well, I think it's the offensive is in motion across the country, whether Trump is leading it or not. Yeah. But no question, it's turbocharged with Trump in charge. And that's what he looks to be in charge. He's not going anywhere. He was just speaking at the North Carolina Republican Convention this weekend. The Republican nomination in 2024 is his for the asking if he wants it. So, 80% of Republicans still approve of Trump. And here's the really frightening statistic in a recent Reuters Ipsos poll. 53% of Republicans said that Trump is still the rightful president. This is nuts, but this is a mass psychosis that has enveloped the whole Republican Party.